Hi, I'm Michael Bradford, and thank you for checking out my channel. Today we're going to talk about doing something that everyone has to do sooner or later, especially if you're working with orchestral music, and that's called doing a takedown. A takedown is basically listening to a piece of music by ear, figuring out what all the instruments are doing, transcribing them, writing them down so that a real orchestra can play them, or so that you could reproduce them using MIDI. Now, when you use MIDI, you're probably going to be using some sort of notation software, but also you're going to be using some samples. What I wanted to do is recreate, but update some of the music of my favorite composer, Bernard Herrmann. So I chose some pieces, and I'm putting together an album that's called The Man Behind the Curtain. They're all pieces composed originally by Bernard Herrmann, and they come from various movies that he worked on that are very well loved by all music lovers. Today I'm going to talk about the theme to Psycho, the opening credits or the prelude to Psycho. This is the music that runs during the title sequence. But what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about just the first 4 bars and how I built that up to make it sound full, like a real orchestra. The pieces I used Pro Tools for my recording software. I used Sibelius for my notation software, which is what an orchestra would need if I perform this. And I have already performed this music live with a 40-piece orchestra. So I have to have sheet music for them to read. In the case of what I'm doing for my recording, it's really MIDI. And so I'm using Pro Tools and the MIDI features of Pro Tools, and I'm using software from Spitfire Audio for my string orchestra samples. There's other samples in there too, but we'll get to them in another video. The library I'm using is called Spitfire Studio Strings. Spitfire makes a lot of different orchestra samples, and so do lots of other companies. East West, there's a lot of companies that make and sell sample libraries. The thing about the Spitfire Studio Strings library that makes it unique is that it's recorded more in a drier sounding recording studio environment as opposed to a really reverberant concert hall environment. But if you listen to Psycho, you'll notice that the entire score, first of all, is strings. There's no percussion or anything else. So that's going to have a drier sound because there's not this big, gigantic orchestra hall. So I wanted to do something similar. That's why I selected that particular library. My intro has 4 MIDI tracks. The first track is spiccato violins. What does spiccato mean? It's a sort of staccato, which is very short, but you achieve spiccato by bouncing the bow off the string slightly when you're hitting it to give it a real punch. The next thing I added was what we call long sol pont violin. Now, sol pont is short for sol ponticello, which means played near the bridge of the violin. So on any stringed instrument, if it says sol pont, that means bow it near the bridge. Again, it makes it sound brighter, a little more edgy. Then I have sol pont cello. And finally, I have pizzicato bass. Pizzicato means you pluck it instead of using a bow. If you use a bow, we call that arco. Now, for those of you who already know this, that's great. But for people who haven't worked directly with strings, that's why I'm explaining it to you. As a matter of fact, long as we're at it, I want to recommend you get some books on orchestration and on harmony and things like that. There's an author named Walter Piston who wrote some incredible books. And the book I use the most is called Orchestration. He also has one called Harmony, and he has one called Counterpoint. And if you read these 3 books, even if you haven't had a chance to go to music school or anything like that, you're going to learn what you need to know so that you can take your MIDI type string arrangements and convert them into something that an orchestra can read and understand, and speak a language that a composer or a conductor will understand. The more you know about how each instrument works, the more realistic your orchestrations are going to sound when you build them up using MIDI. Now, let's start at the beginning. The first instrument we're going to listen to is the spiccato violins. When you listen to it, you're going to notice they sound very dry and they're very short. Let's check that out. Now, when you listen to that, you'll notice it just seems to be playing one chord. But there's more to it than that, because this piece has more movement than that. It's really two notes. But to get that initial bite, I wanted to use the spiccato strings. Now, when I add the long sol-pont violins, you'll notice that it's playing two notes instead of one. It's more da-da-da-da-da-da instead of just dun-dun-dun-dun. That's going to increase the realism of the sound. This is a more legato, so it doesn't have as much bite at the beginning, but it has a much smoother roll-off at the end. So we have to combine them together. Now, this is what the sol-pont violins sound like by themselves. And this is what they sound like combined with the spiccato violins. Now, the sol-pont violins cover some of the viola range too. The next thing we add, though, is celli. We have the long sol-pont celli, again played near the bridge. This is how they sound on their own. And this is how they sound as part of the ensemble. There's only one more instrument we need to add for this section, and that is bass. So this time I loaded a pizzicato bass. Pizzicato, again, is plucked with the finger, not used with a bow. That's not arco, it's pizzicato. Let's hear the pizzicato bass by itself. And let's hear it as part of the ensemble. Now, you're hearing the full ensemble, but it still sounds a little dry. Because this is an older movie, and because I wanted it to have more of a DJ vibe, what I did then was I put some processing on this whole thing. And I used several pieces of plugins to do the processing. I used the Focusrite Red 3 compressor. I used the Avid 7-band EQ, which is built into Pro Tools. It comes with it. I used a filter, which is very important for a lot of the things that I do. And DJs and remixers use filters all the time. There's a great company called Mac DSP, and they make a product called Filter Bank. And that's what I'm using for filtering. When I'm using a filter, in this particular case, I'm chopping off a lot of the low end, and I'm also chopping off a lot of the high end. And I'm putting a peak somewhere in the mid-range. Now, later in the song, I can actually automate this plug-in so that the peak moves back and forth throughout the frequency band, which gives us a nice sweeping tone change. And the great thing about plugins is you can automate them. So I use that too. And finally, I used a reverb program called Space. Now, Space is really cool because you can load in different impulse responses, the sound of different locations. And this particular patch I loaded in is a beautiful European concert hall called the Concert Cabot. And it is gorgeous to look at, but also it's a wonderful sounding room. So by loading that impulse response in, I'm able to get a beautiful reverb, but because I'm filtering it with the filter, it cuts off a lot of the high and lows of the reverb too. So this is how the whole thing sounds all together with processing. And now the beat comes in. The beat that you're hearing is the next section of the song. And this is where the groove happens. For this, I'm using an electric piano, I'm using some other instruments, and even upright jazz type bass. I'll get to how I did that in the next video. But I wanted to show you how you do a takedown and how orchestration works and how we can start with very little and end up with just what we need. It's easy to take a string pad on a keyboard and sort of play everything all at once. but it's much more realistic to load the right sounds for the right instrument and play them one at a time. You can adjust the mix better, but also each instrument will sound much more natural. And that's really what you're going for. If you're a composer or if you're an arranger and you need to present your music to a client or an artist, the more realistic it sounds, the more likely they are to use your work. And that's what it's really all about. Thank you for checking this out. I'm going to make more videos as we go. I'm going to go through this whole song. There's a lot of other instruments, and there's even some really cool voice work that my friend Creed Bratton did to sort of bring this thing to a whole nother level. In the meantime, keep making music. There's nothing like it. And I hope that we can see each other in the future.